At 05:30 hours on October the 25th, 1944, the deck of USS Essex was a choreographed chaos of movement barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Flight deck crew in colored jerseys moved between 36 Grumman F6F Hellcats spotted on the wooden deck, each aircraft fueled, armed, and ready. The ship's engines vibrated through the steel hull as Essex turned into the wind, building speed to 27 knots. In flag plot, Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman watched the chronometer. He had ordered a maximum effort launch, every available fighter airborne in minimum time. The Japanese mobile fleet was 200 miles west, and American reconnaissance had spotted them at first light. Sherman needed his fighters in the air before Japanese strike aircraft could launch. What happened in the next 9 minutes would demonstrate an industrial and organizational capability that Japanese commanders had never anticipated and could not match. Below deck in Ready Room 4, Lieutenant Commander John McCampbell reviewed the briefing one final time with his pilots. They would launch in division strength, 4 aircraft at a time, climbing immediately to Angels 20. The mission was combat air patrol over the task force, protecting the carriers from expected Japanese attacks. McCampbell had flown from Essex since May. He knew the ship's capabilities intimately. He knew the flight deck crews could launch aircraft faster than any other carrier in the Pacific Fleet. But even he didn't fully appreciate what was about to happen. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The announcement came over the flight deck loudspeaker at 05:32. Pilots man your planes. On the hangar deck below, plane handlers released the final 8 Hellcats from the overhead tie-downs and positioned them on the aircraft elevators. The forward elevator and the aft elevator, each capable of lifting 2 fighters simultaneously, began rising toward flight deck level. 30 seconds later, those 8 aircraft rolled onto the deck, bringing the total spotted aircraft to 44. The remaining 28 fighters would come up in subsequent elevator cycles during the launch sequence. This wasn't improvisation. This was procedure. Essex-class carriers had been designed specifically for rapid aircraft operations. Every detail of the flight deck layout, every piece of handling equipment, every crew position had been engineered to maximize launch and recovery rates. The design philosophy was simple. More aircraft in the air, faster, meant more combat power available when needed. The Japanese had built carriers for quality. The Americans had built carriers for quantity and speed. The Essex-class design had emerged from painful lessons learned in 1942. At the Battle of Midway, American carriers had struggled to launch coordinated strikes. Aircraft took too long to spot on deck, too long to start engines, too long to launch in sequence. The delays had mattered. At Coral Sea and Midway, American carriers were caught with aircraft on deck during Japanese attacks. Fires spread rapidly through fueled and armed aircraft. Ships burned and sank within minutes. The Navy recognized that carrier survival depended on getting aircraft off the deck quickly. Empty decks were safe decks. Spotted decks were vulnerabilities waiting to explode. This recognition drove the design specifications for the Essex-class program. The Essex-class carriers displaced 47,000 tons at full load. Length overall was 872 feet. Beam at the flight deck was 147 feet. The flight deck itself was 872 feet by 108 feet of wooden planking over steel structure. 4 steam catapults, 2 forward and 2 at the waist, could accelerate aircraft to flying speed, but catapults were rarely used in 1944 for routine launches. Hellcats could take off under their own power using the full deck length, and deck launches were faster than catapult launches. Catapults required crews to hook up each aircraft individually, test the holdback mechanism, and signal the launch. The entire process took 60 to 90 seconds per aircraft. Deck launches allowed aircraft to roll forward continuously with minimal delay between planes. The key innovation was the deck arrangement. Essex carried 3 aircraft elevators, 2 centerline elevators, 1 forward of the island, and 1 aft, plus a deck edge elevator on the port side just aft of the island. Previous American carriers had used 2 centerline elevators. The third elevator increased the rate at which aircraft could be brought from the hangar deck to the flight deck. During launch operations, the elevators ran continuously, cycling aircraft upward while flight operations continued. Japanese carriers typically used 2 elevators maximum, and Japanese elevator cycles were slower. The equipment was less powerful and the procedures less streamlined. A Japanese carrier might need 12 to 15 minutes to bring 30 aircraft from hangar to flight deck. Essex could do the same movement in 6 to 7 minutes while simultaneously launching aircraft that were already spotted. The second innovation was standardization. Every Essex-class carrier was functionally identical. Flight deck layout was the same. Equipment positions were the same. Procedures were the same. A plane handler could transfer from Lexington to Bunker Hill to Intrepid and immediately understand the system. Crews trained to the same standards using the same manuals. Standardization meant that lessons learned on one ship immediately applied to all ships. When Essex discovered a more efficient way to spot aircraft as for launch, the procedure was documented and distributed fleet-wide. Within weeks, every Essex-class carrier was using the improved method. The institutional learning curve was remarkably steep. Japanese carriers were individual designs. Shokaku and Zuikaku were sisters, but Hiryu differed significantly from Soryu. Akagi and Kaga were unique designs. Each ship had different flight deck arrangements, different elevator positions, different handling procedures. Lessons learned on one carrier didn't necessarily transfer to others. The lack of standardization meant each crew had to develop their own expertise independently. The third innovation was crew size and training. An Essex-class carrier had a ship's company of approximately 2,600 officers and men, plus an air group of approximately 2,000 personnel. Flight deck operations required about 300 specialized crew members working simultaneously. Plane handlers moved aircraft into position. Flight deck officers directed the choreography. Ordnance men armed weapons, fuelers topped off tanks. Plane captains performed final checks. Catapult crews stood ready if needed. Aircraft mechanics troubleshot any mechanical problems. The coordination was extraordinary. Every person knew their role. Every role was essential. Remove any single element and the entire system slowed down. The training pipeline for flight deck crew was intensive. Schools at San Diego and Norfolk taught basic procedures. New crew members spent weeks learning to handle aircraft safely. They learned hand signals, tie-down procedures, fueling protocols, and emergency responses. After school, they reported to carriers for on-the-job training under experienced petty officers. The learning continued throughout their tours. Flight deck operations were dangerous. Spinning propellers could kill instantly. Jet blasts from engines could blow men overboard. Arresting cables under tension could cut a person in half if they broke. One moment of inattention could be fatal. So crews learned to move with constant awareness, watching multiple hazards simultaneously, communicating through hand signals because engine noise made voice communication impossible. Japanese carrier deck crews were equally skilled at their specific tasks, but they operated with smaller crews and less systematic training. Japanese doctrine emphasized smaller air groups and fewer flight operations per day. A Japanese carrier might launch 2 strikes daily. Recovery operations happened when aircraft returned. The pace was deliberate. American doctrine emphasized maximum sortie rates. Launch, recover, rearm, refuel, launch again. The goal was to keep as many aircraft in the air as possible throughout daylight hours. Essex might conduct 8 to 10 launch and recovery cycles in a single day. The operational tempo was relentless, and it required crew procedures optimized for speed. On the morning of October the 25th, the Essex flight deck crew demonstrated exactly how fast those procedures could be. At 05:35, the 1st Division of Hellcats started engines. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. 18 cylinders per engine, 2,200 horsepower at full throttle. The sound was overwhelming. 4 aircraft running simultaneously, created a wall of noise that made the deck vibrate. Exhaust smoke drifted across the deck in the wind. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel and hot oil filled the air. The flight deck officer, standing on the port side near the island, raised his checkered flag. The signal was clear. Prepare to launch. The first Hellcat, piloted by Lieutenant Commander McCampbell, rolled forward. Plane handlers pulled the wheel chocks. McCampbell released his brakes and advanced his throttle. The Hellcat accelerated down the deck, 872 feet, from brake release to bow. The aircraft needed about 450 feet to reach flying speed with a 27-knot wind over the deck. McCampbell's Hellcat left the deck at 0536, climbing immediately into the dark sky. Total time, from engine start to wheels off, 60 seconds. The second Hellcat rolled forward 10 seconds later, then the third, then the fourth. The interval between aircraft was carefully calculated, long enough that each aircraft cleared the deck before the next one began its roll, short enough that the launch sequence continued without wasted time. Essex could launch one aircraft every 15 seconds using this method, 4 aircraft per minute. The mathematics was straightforward, but the execution required precision. By 0540, the first division of 4 Hellcats was airborne and climbing. The second division was rolling. The third division engines were starting. The 4th through 9th divisions were spotted aft on the deck, waiting their turn. Meanwhile, the aircraft elevators continued cycling. 4 more Hellcats came up from the hangar deck. Plane handlers moved them into position. The choreography was continuous. Aircraft moving forward to launch, aircraft coming up from below, crews moving between planes, checking, fueling, arming. The flight deck was organized chaos that somehow functioned with mechanical efficiency. Japanese observers watching through periscopes from submarines had reported American carrier operations previously. The reports described rapid launches, but didn't provide enough detail for Japanese commanders to understand the full implications. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had read intelligence summaries about American carriers launching large formations quickly. He assumed the reports were exaggerated. American carriers were larger than Japanese carriers, so naturally they could launch more aircraft. But Onishi believed the launch rates would be roughly comparable. A carrier could only launch as fast as aircraft could be positioned and engines started. Human limitations applied equally to both sides. He was wrong. Human limitations did apply, but the Americans had engineered around many of those limitations through equipment design and procedural optimization. At 0545, Essex had 24 Hellcats airborne. The launch continued. The 32nd and 33rd aircraft came up the aft elevator. Plane handlers positioned them. Engines started. The Hellcats rolled forward and launched. By 0550, 48 aircraft were airborne. The deck was almost clear. Only spotted aircraft remaining were those waiting for the final elevator cycles. The last group of Hellcats came up from the hangar deck. Engines started immediately. One after another, they launched. At 0559, exactly 9 minutes after the first engine start, the 72nd Hellcat left the deck. Lieutenant Junior Grade, the pilot, joined the formation circling above the task force at Angels 15. Admiral Sherman watched from flag plot as reports came in. 72 fighters, airborne. All systems normal, no aircraft casualties, no deck accidents. Launch complete in 9 minutes. The capability was exactly what Essex had been designed to deliver, but seeing it executed perfectly under combat conditions validated the entire design philosophy. Sherman knew the Japanese couldn't match this performance. Intelligence had provided detailed information about Japanese carrier capabilities. Japanese carriers could launch strikes of 40 to 50 aircraft, but the launch sequence typically required 20 to 30 minutes. The difference mattered enormously in tactical situations. The 72 Hellcats climbed to assigned patrol stations. They would spend the next 2 hours maintaining combat air patrol over the task force. When their fuel ran low, they would land, and another group would launch to replace them. Essex would maintain continuous fighter coverage throughout daylight hours. The system allowed for overlapping patrols. As one group landed, the next group was already airborne and climbing to altitude. Japanese commanders planning strikes against American carriers had to assume that American fighters would be waiting. The assumption was correct. The combat information centers aboard American carriers tracked everything within 150 miles. Fighter directors vectored patrols to intercept any threatening contacts. The combination of radar detection and rapid launch capability meant American carriers could generate defensive fighter coverage faster than Japanese carriers could launch strikes. This advantage had developed gradually throughout 1943 and 44. At Tarawa, in November 1943, Essex-class carriers provided continuous air cover for amphibious landings. Japanese aircraft attempting to attack the landing forces encountered Hellcats positioned perfectly through radar direction. At Kwajalein in February 1944, the pattern repeated. At the Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944, the advantage became overwhelming. Japanese strike formations flew into walls of American fighters launched systematically from multiple carriers using coordinated procedures. The result was slaughter. 346 Japanese aircraft destroyed on June 19th alone. The rapid launch capability of Essex-class carriers was one component of that defensive system. Detection came from radar. Coordination came from combat information centers. Execution came from trained pilots in superior aircraft. But getting those pilots airborne quickly was essential. Without rapid launch, even perfect radar detection and coordination couldn't position enough fighters to stop large Japanese strikes. Essex and her sister ships provided the platform that made the entire system work. The engineering that enabled this capability had begun in 1940 and 41 during the design phase. Naval architects at the Bureau of Ships studied previous carrier designs. They analyzed what worked and what didn't. They reviewed action reports from early war engagements. They consulted with experienced carrier officers about operational requirements. The accumulated lessons informed every design decision. Flight deck length was maximized to allow deck launches without catapults. Flight deck width was maximized to allow simultaneous spotting and launching operations. Elevator capacity was increased to move more aircraft faster. Hangar deck height was set at 17.5 feet to accommodate the largest aircraft expected. The propulsion system was designed for sustained high-speed operations. 4 Westinghouse-geared steam turbines produced 150,000 shaft horsepower. Maximum speed was 33 knots. More importantly, Essex could maintain 27 knots continuously, hour after hour. Without mechanical stress, flight operations required carriers to steam into the wind at high speed. The stronger the wind over the deck, the shorter the takeoff roll for launching aircraft, and the slower the approach speed for recovering aircraft. Essex could generate that wind reliably whenever needed. The design also incorporated lessons about damage control and survivability. The hangar deck was closed and armored, unlike British carriers, which used armored flight decks and open hangar sides. American designers believed that keeping explosions contained was more important than armoring against bombs penetrating from above. Multiple watertight compartments limited flooding if the hull was torpedoed. Fire suppression systems could flood magazine spaces instantly if fires threatened ammunition storage. The ships were designed to absorb damage and continue operating. This philosophy contrasted with Japanese carrier design, which emphasized offensive capability over defensive survivability. Japanese carriers had lighter construction, larger aircraft capacity relative to displacement, and more powerful initial striking capability. But they were more vulnerable to damage. When American bombs or torpedoes hit Japanese carriers, fires spread rapidly, fuel vapors accumulated in hangar spaces, secondary explosions were common. Japanese carriers at Midway, Coral Sea, and Philippine Sea all suffered catastrophic damage from relatively few hits. Essex-class carriers proved remarkably resilient. USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs in October 1944. The damage was severe, but the ship survived. Franklin was hit again in March 1945 by two more bombs that caused massive fires. Over 800 crew members died, but the ship didn't sink. Damage control parties contained the fires. The ship steamed under her own power back to the United States for repairs. USS Bunker Hill was hit by two kamikazes in May 1945. Fires burned for hours. Nearly 400 men died. The ship survived. The design philosophy of building carriers that could absorb punishment and keep fighting proved correct. But on October 25th, the immediate concern wasn't survival under attack. The concern was generating maximum combat power as quickly as possible. Essex had just demonstrated that capability. 72 fighters, airborne in 9 minutes. The formation, circling overhead, represented more combat aircraft than many entire Japanese carrier air groups, and Essex still had dive bombers and torpedo aircraft in the hangar deck, ready to launch for strike missions if needed. The total air group numbered approximately 100 aircraft. Japanese carriers typically operated 60 to 70 aircraft total. Admiral Sherman received a report from the Combat Information Center. Radar contacts bearing 270, range 180 miles, multiple groups, estimated 40-plus aircraft, Japanese strike incoming. Sherman ordered fighter directors to vector the combat air patrol to intercept. The 72 Hellcats that had just launched turned west and climbed to Angels 24. They would engage the Japanese formation approximately 80 miles from the task force, well before Japanese aircraft could threaten any American carriers. This was exactly the scenario that Essex had been designed for. Rapid launch, immediate combat air patrol, radar-directed interception, the system functioning as intended. Japanese commanders planning the strike had assumed American fighters would be scrambled after radar detected the incoming raid. They calculated that American fighters would still be climbing to altitude when the Japanese formation reached bombing range. That assumption had been valid in 1942. It was obsolete by 1944. Essex could launch 72 fighters in 9 minutes. Those fighters could reach Angels 20 in another 12 minutes. Total time from launch order to combat-ready patrol at altitude was 21 minutes. Japanese strike aircraft at cruising speed covered approximately 3 miles per minute. From detection at 180 miles to reaching American carriers was 60 minutes, more than enough time for Essex to launch, climb, and position fighters for interception. The mathematics of carrier combat had changed fundamentally, not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through systematic engineering and procedural optimization that accumulated into overwhelming advantage. Essex represented the culmination of that development. 24 Essex-class carriers would be completed before the end of the war. 8 more were under construction, but not finished before Japan surrendered. The class became the backbone of American naval aviation for decades. Many served through the 1950s and 60s. Some were modernized and served into the 1970s. USS Lexington, commissioned in February 1943, served as a training carrier until 1991. 48 years of service. The design was that successful. The Hellcats, vectored west by Combat Information Center, reached the Japanese formation at 0615, 78 miles from Task Force 58. Lieutenant Commander McCampbell led the intercept. His division had climbed to Angels 24 and positioned themselves 5,000 feet above the incoming Japanese strike. The Japanese formation consisted of 43 aircraft, Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers, Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers, and a handful of Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters providing escort. They were flying in loose formation at Angels 18, heading directly toward the American carriers. McCampbell assessed the tactical situation in seconds. The Japanese had altitude disadvantage. They were in level flight with no apparent awareness that American fighters were above them. The Combat Information Center vectoring had been perfect. McCampbell rolled his Hellcat into a steep diving attack. His wingman followed. The second section followed. 12 Hellcats dove on the Japanese formation. From the sun angle, the Japanese Zero pilots had spotted them at the last moment and tried to turn into the attack. Too late. McCampbell fired a long burst into a B-6N. The torpedo bomber exploded. His wingman destroyed another. Within 30 seconds, 6 Japanese aircraft were burning and falling toward the ocean. The Japanese formation scattered. Discipline collapsed as individual pilots broke formation to evade or engage. More Hellcat divisions arrived from different vectors. The Combat Information Center had coordinated multiple intercept groups to hit the Japanese strike simultaneously from multiple directions. The Japanese pilots found themselves surrounded. Every direction they turned, more Hellcats appeared. The engagement became a massacre. Japanese pilots who had launched expecting to attack American carriers found themselves fighting desperately for survival 80 miles from their targets. By 0630, the Japanese strike had been destroyed. 37 of 43 aircraft shot down. The 6 survivors turned back toward their carriers, jettisoning their bombs and torpedoes to gain speed. They would report that American defenses were impenetrable. The carriers were protected by massive combat air patrols positioned perfectly to intercept. The report was accurate. What the survivors couldn't explain was how the Americans had known exactly where the Japanese formation was and had positioned fighters so precisely. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi received the report aboard his flagship, the heavy cruiser Maya. He had been monitoring radio communications throughout the engagement. The transmissions from his strike leader became increasingly desperate as the ambush developed. Then silence. Onishi understood that most of his aircraft were lost. What he didn't understand was how the Americans had achieved such complete tactical superiority. His intelligence staff had reported American carriers in the area. They had estimated American air group strength at approximately 60 to 70 fighters per carrier, comparable to Japanese carriers. 4 American carriers would have approximately 250 to 300 fighters total. Maintaining combat air patrol would require cycling those fighters. Perhaps 1/3 would be airborne at any time. 80 to 100 fighters on patrol seemed reasonable, but the intercept his strike had just encountered involved at least 60 to 70 American fighters, all positioned perfectly, all at superior altitude, all coordinated in their attacks. Either American carriers had far more aircraft than intelligence estimated, or they could generate much higher sortie rates than Japanese carriers could achieve. Onishi suspected both factors were true. He ordered his staff to analyze American carrier capabilities more thoroughly. The analysis would eventually confirm what Onishi suspected. American Essex X-class carriers operated air groups of approximately 100 aircraft. They could launch and recover aircraft at rates Japanese carriers couldn't match. They could maintain continuous combat air patrols at strength levels that consumed most of a Japanese carrier's entire fighter complement. The tactical implications were devastating. Japanese doctrine relied on coordinated strikes by large formations. 40 to 60 aircraft attacking simultaneously would overwhelm carrier defenses through sheer numbers. Some aircraft would be shot down, but enough would penetrate to deliver attacks. That doctrine had worked at Pearl Harbor, at Darwin, at Ceylon. It had worked because defending fighters couldn't intercept large formations effectively. A few fighters might shoot down a few attackers, but most would get through. American carriers in 1944 presented entirely different defenses. Radar-detected strikes at extreme range, combat information centers, coordinated intercepts. Carriers launched massive fighter patrols quickly. The defending fighters outnumbered the attackers and were positioned perfectly through radar direction. Japanese strike formations were destroyed before reaching their targets. Onishi recognized that continuing conventional strikes against American carriers would simply waste aircraft and pilots. Japanese naval aviation was already critically short of experienced pilots. The training program couldn't replace losses. Every pilot killed was irreplaceable. Throwing those pilots into attacks that had minimal chance of success was strategically insane. Alternative methods had to be considered. Onishi had been thinking about alternatives for months. The concept that kept returning was deliberate suicide attacks. If a pilot couldn't survive long enough to aim and release a bomb. Perhaps he could guide his aircraft directly into the target. One aircraft, one pilot, one guaranteed hit if the pilot reached the target. The mathematics seemed favorable. Conventional attacks resulted in perhaps 10% of aircraft successfully hitting targets. 90% were shot down or missed. Suicide attacks might achieve 30 or 40% hit rates. Each successful attack would sink or cripple a carrier. The exchange ratio, aircraft lost versus carriers damaged, would favor Japan even though the human cost was terrible. The concept violated every tradition of Japanese naval aviation. Pilots were trained to attack and return. Missions were carefully planned to maximize survival. Losing pilots unnecessarily was wasteful and dishonorable. But by October 1944, survival was no longer possible in conventional attacks. Pilots launched, knowing they probably wouldn't return. The distinction between suicide attacks and hopeless conventional attacks was becoming negligible. Onishi began discussing the concept with his staff officers. Some were horrified. Others argued that desperate circumstances required desperate measures. The debate would continue for another 2 weeks before the first organized kamikaze attacks were authorized. But the seed of that decision was planted on October the 25th, when conventional strikes failed so completely. Aboard Essex, Admiral Sherman watched his fighters return from the interception. The landing pattern was as choreographed as the launch had been. Hellcats approached from astern at Angels 2, descending to 600 feet. The landing signal officer stood on a platform at the port side of the flight deck aft, holding colored paddles. He guided each aircraft through the final approach. The pilot watched the LSO signals: higher, lower, faster, slower. If the approach looked good, the LSO gave the cut signal. The pilot chopped throttle and dropped onto the deck. An arresting hook trailing from the aircraft's tail caught one of 8 wire cables stretched across the deck. The cable pulled out several hundred feet, decelerating the aircraft from 90 miles per hour to 0 in 2 seconds. The deceleration was violent, but controlled. As soon as the Hellcat stopped, plane handlers rushed forward, released the hook from the cable, and pushed this aircraft forward to clear the landing area. The entire sequence, from touchdown to cleared deck, took 30 seconds. Another Hellcat was already in the landing pattern. Essex recovered all 72 fighters in 46 minutes. As fighters landed, plane handlers moved them forward to parking areas or struck them below on the elevators to the hangar deck. Immediately after landing, ordnance men checked ammunition expenditure, fuelers topped off tanks, plane captains inspected for damage. Aircraft that needed maintenance were tagged and sent to the hangar deck. Aircraft that were ready for immediate relaunch were refueled, rearmed, and respotted on the flight deck. The cycle was continuous. Land, service, relaunch. Essex could maintain 4-hour combat air patrols indefinitely by rotating fighter divisions through this cycle. Japanese carriers attempted similar operations, but at slower tempo. A Japanese carrier might recover and relaunch a fighter division in 90 minutes to 2 hours. Essex could do the same in 60 to 70 minutes. The difference accumulated throughout the day. After 8 hours of operations, Essex would have completed multiple cycles, while a Japanese carrier was still working through its second or third cycle. The sortie rate advantage translated directly into combat power. More American fighters in the air more often meant better coverage and more intercepts. The procedural efficiency came from systematic analysis and training. After each operation, the Air Department conducted debrief sessions. What worked well? What could be improved? Small inefficiencies were identified and corrected. A plane handler discovered that repositioning chock positions saved 8 seconds per aircraft. That innovation was documented and taught to all plane handlers. Across a 72-aircraft launch, 8 seconds per aircraft saved 9 minutes total. Fueling procedures were analyzed and optimized. Refueling a Hellcat originally took 12 minutes. Improved nozzle designs and better positioning reduced that to 7 minutes. Ordnance loading was streamlined through better bomb and ammunition placement in the magazines. Every procedure was examined for possible improvement. The Japanese conducted similar analyses, but institutional culture limited implementation. Japanese Navy emphasized individual initiative and adaptation. Standardization was viewed as constraining. Each carrier developed its own procedures based on the preferences of the air officer and deck crew. What worked on Shikaku might be done differently on Zuikaku. There was no systematic sharing of best practices across ships. Improvements discovered on one carrier remained local knowledge. The lack of standardization meant that operational efficiency varied significantly between ships. Some Japanese carriers were well run with efficient procedures. Others were less effective. American standardization meant every Essex-class carrier operated at high efficiency. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The flight deck procedures that enabled rapid launches were only one component of carrier effectiveness. The other critical component was maintenance and logistics. Aircraft required constant maintenance. Engines needed servicing every 100 hours of operation. Hydraulic systems developed leaks. Electrical systems failed. Battle damage needed repair. Essex had extensive maintenance facilities in the hangar deck. Machine shops could fabricate replacement parts. Electronics shops repaired radar and radio equipment. Engine shops could overhaul complete Pratt & Whitney engines. The ship carried spare parts for every component of every aircraft type embarked. When an aircraft was damaged or developed mechanical problems, the maintenance crews could usually repair it within hours or days. Japanese carriers had maintenance facilities, but spare parts availability was problematic. Japan's industrial base couldn't produce spare parts at the rate American industry could. Japanese carriers operating far from home base often ran short of critical components. An aircraft might be grounded for weeks waiting for a replacement propeller or engine part. The problem worsened throughout 1944 as American submarines disrupted supply lines. Parts that should have reached forward bases never arrived. The attrition of repairable aircraft was nearly as damaging as combat losses. Essex received regular replenishment from fleet oilers and ammunition ships. Every few days, the carrier would rendezvous with supply ships and take on fuel oil and aviation gasoline, bombs, ammunition, and spare parts. The logistics tail supporting American carrier operations was massive. Hundreds of supply ships moved constantly between Pearl Harbor forward bases and the combat zone. The fleet train, as it was called, enabled sustained operations thousands of miles from the nearest major port. Task Force 58 could remain at sea for months, conducting continuous operations because the supply system kept everything flowing. Japanese logistics were far less robust. Japanese carriers had to return to major bases periodically for resupply. The Imperial Japanese Navy had fewer supply ships, and those ships were increasingly vulnerable to submarine attack. American submarines sank dozens of Japanese tankers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels throughout 1944. Each sinking reduced Japan's ability to sustain forward operations. By October, Japanese carriers were operating on minimal supplies with limited ability to replace losses. The cumulative effect of these logistical and procedural advantages was that American carriers could sustain high-tempo operations indefinitely, while Japanese carriers could not. Essex launched 72 fighters in 9 minutes on October the 25th. She could repeat that performance every day for months. Japanese carriers might achieve a comparable launch once or twice, but they couldn't sustain that pace. After a week of intensive operations, Japanese carriers would be running low on fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and operational aircraft. Essex would still be at full capability. Admiral Sherman understood these advantages intellectually, but watching Essex demonstrate them in combat provided satisfaction beyond analysis. The ship and crew were performing exactly as designed. The investment in engineering, training, and logistics was producing measurable tactical superiority. Sherman drafted a report to Admiral William Halsey, commander of 3rd Fleet, describing the morning's operations. Launched 72 fighters in 9 minutes. Intercepted and destroyed Japanese strike 78 miles from task force. 0 damage to American ships. The report was factual and understated, but Sherman knew Halsey would appreciate the significance. Halsey responded within hours. "Well done, Essex. Maintain combat air patrol. Expect further Japanese strikes throughout the day. The estimate was correct. Japanese commanders, not yet willing to abandon conventional tactics, launched 2 more strikes during the afternoon of October the 25th. Both were detected by radar at extreme range. Both were intercepted by Hellcats launched from Essex and other carriers in the task force. Both were destroyed with minimal American losses. By the end of October the 25th, Japanese naval aviation had lost over 100 aircraft attempting to attack Task Force 58. American losses were 6 fighters. The one-sided nature of these engagements was starting to affect Japanese morale. Pilots who survived missions returned to their carriers demoralized and exhausted. They reported that American defenses couldn't be penetrated. Radio communications from aircraft under attack described overwhelming numbers of American fighters appearing from perfect positions. The pilots knew they were flying into traps, but had no choice except to follow orders. The psychological strain was enormous. Some pilots wrote farewell letters before missions. Others requested transfers to different duties. The fatalism that had begun appearing in June after the Marianas turkey shoot became pervasive after the October engagements. Japanese commanders faced an impossible situation. They needed to stop the American advance. Attacking American carriers was the logical method, but conventional attacks weren't working. The technological and procedural gap was too large. American radar, fighter direction, rapid launch capability, and superior logistics created a system that Japanese forces couldn't overcome through better tactics or pilot skill. Something different was required. That something would be the organized kamikaze attacks that began on October 25th, later in the day. The first deliberate suicide attacks were conducted by pilots from the Philippines-based 2nd Air Fleet. 5 Zero fighters, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, dove deliberately into American escort carriers off Samar. 4 hit their targets. USS St. Lo was sunk. Several other escort carriers were damaged. The kamikaze attacks achieved better results than conventional strikes. The hit rate was much higher. American defenses could shoot down many kamikaze aircraft, but stopping all of them required perfect interception. Any aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen would hit a ship. There was no evasive maneuvering, no bomb-aiming errors, no missed attacks. The pilot guided his aircraft directly into the target until impact. The psychological impact on American sailors was also significant. Defending against pilots trying to kill you was one thing. Defending against pilots trying to die while killing you was something different. The fanaticism was disturbing, even to experienced combat veterans, but kamikaze attacks, while more effective than conventional strikes, still didn't solve Japan's fundamental problem. American industrial production vastly exceeded Japanese production. America could build carriers, aircraft, and train pilots faster than Japan could sink ships or shoot down planes. The exchange ratio, even with kamikaze attacks, favored America. Japan lost 1 pilot and 1 aircraft per hit. America could absorb the damage, repair the ships, and continue operations. Some damaged ships returned to combat within weeks. The escort carriers hit on October the 25th were replaced by new construction arriving from American shipyards. Essex-class carriers under construction in 1944 numbered 8, and all would be completed by mid-1945. Japan had no carriers under construction that would be completed before the war ended. The strategic situation was hopeless for Japan by October 1944. Military leaders understood this, but political considerations prevented surrender. The concept of accepting defeat was culturally unacceptable. Fighting to the end, regardless of cost, was considered honorable. Surrender was shameful. This cultural framework drove decisions that prolonged the war for another 10 months, resulting in hundreds of thousands of additional deaths on both sides. The kamikaze attacks were part of that pattern. Tactical innovations that extracted maximum damage from dwindling resources, while accepting total loss of the expended forces. Essex continued operations throughout the remainder of October and November. The ship participated in strikes against Japanese positions in the Philippines, Formosa, and Okinawa. Combat air patrols were maintained continuously. Japanese air attacks continued but were intercepted and destroyed with monotonous consistency. Essex recorded 34 confirmed kills during October. 41 in November, the ship's air group became one of the most successful in the Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant Commander McCampbell personally destroyed 34 Japanese aircraft between June and November 1944, becoming the Navy's leading ace of the war. The success came at cost. Essex lost 18 aircraft to combat damage, mechanical failure, and operational accidents during those 6 months. 11 pilots and aircrew were killed, 23 were wounded. The losses were light compared to Japanese losses, but each death was mourned. The ship's chaplain conducted services for the fallen. Personal effects were collected and sent to families. The losses were accepted as the price of war, but never casually. By December 1944, Essex had been in continuous combat operations for 8 months. The ship needed maintenance. Hull barnacles reduced speed. Boiler tubes needed cleaning. Aircraft elevators required servicing. The crew needed rest. Admiral Sherman requested permission to rotate Essex back to Pearl Harbor for maintenance and crew liberty. The request was approved. Essex departed the combat zone on December the 15th and arrived at Pearl Harbor on December the 21st. The ship would spend 3 weeks in port, then return to combat operations for the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. During the Pearl Harbor maintenance period, Essex received upgrades. Additional anti-aircraft guns were installed to improve defense against kamikaze attacks. Radar systems were updated to the latest models. The Combat Information Center received improved plotting equipment. Flight deck tie-down points were reinforced. The modifications reflected lessons learned during recent operations. The Navy was constantly analyzing combat data and implementing improvements. Ships returning from the forward areas received the latest upgrades before returning to combat. The crew also received recognition for their performance. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Fleet, visited Essex on December the 23rd. He toured the ship and spoke with crew members. He presented the Presidential Unit Citation to the ship for extraordinary performance during the Philippine Sea Campaign. The citation specifically mentioned the rapid launch capabilities and effective fighter direction that had contributed to the destruction of Japanese naval aviation. Nimitz told the assembled crew that Essex represented the finest traditions of the Navy. The men had proven that American engineering, training, and determination could overcome any enemy. The speech was morale-building formality, but it was also accurate. Essex returned to combat operations on January 12, 1945. The ship joined Task Force 58 for the invasion of Iwo Jima. American forces would assault the island on February 19th. Carrier aircraft would provide close air support for the Marines and would suppress Japanese air attacks from the home islands. The operation would last 5 weeks and would become one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Essex participated throughout, launching hundreds of sorties, supporting the ground forces, and defending the fleet. The combat tempo during Iwo Jima exceeded anything previously experienced. Essex launched and recovered aircraft from dawn until dusk every day. The flight deck crew worked 16 to 18-hour shifts. Pilots flew 2 or 3 missions daily. Maintenance crews worked continuously, keeping aircraft operational. The logistics system delivered fuel, ammunition, and supplies continuously. The sustained effort demonstrated exactly what American carriers had been designed to do: generate and sustain overwhelming combat power for extended periods. Japanese forces defending Iwo Jima included kamikaze units based on the home islands. These units launched attacks against the American carriers supporting the invasion. Essex was targeted multiple times. On February 21st, a Kamikaze Zero dove on the ship from high altitude. Combat air patrol fighters intercepted and destroyed it 3,000 yards from the ship. On February 25th, another kamikaze approached from low altitude in the confusion of returning American aircraft. The Combat Information Center detected it, but fighter direction was complicated by friendly aircraft in the landing pattern. The kamikaze penetrated within 1,000 yards before being shot down by anti-aircraft fire from Essex and nearby destroyers. The ship survived, both attacks undamaged. But the close calls demonstrated that kamikaze tactics were creating vulnerabilities even in the American defensive system. After Iwo Jima, Essex participated in strikes against the Japanese home islands. On February 16th and 17th, Task Force 58 launched massive strikes against Tokyo area targets. Essex contributed fighters, escorting bombers and conducting strafing attacks on airfields. The strikes destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft on the ground and damaged industrial facilities. The attacks demonstrated that American carriers could operate within range of Japan itself. The strategic implications were clear. American forces could strike anywhere in the Japanese Empire. The final major operation for Essex was the invasion of Okinawa, beginning April 1st, 1945. The battle would last 82 days and would involve the largest concentration of American naval power in the Pacific War. Over 40 carriers, including Essex, provided air support. Japanese forces responded with mass kamikaze attacks. Over 1,500 kamikaze aircraft attacked American ships during the Okinawa campaign. The attacks sank dozens of destroyers and smaller ships. Several escort carriers were hit and damaged, but the fleet carriers, including Essex, survived. The combination of radar detection, fighter direction, and rapid launch capability provided defense even against suicide attacks. Essex shot down 37 confirmed Japanese aircraft during April alone. The ship was attacked directly 4 times, but was not hit. Kamikaze threat forced modifications to American defensive procedures. Combat air patrols were increased from 72 fighters to over 100 when intelligence indicated major attacks were imminent. Essex and other carriers coordinated their fighter coverage to eliminate gaps. Radar picket destroyers positioned 50 to 70 miles from the main task force provided early warning. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats to intercept kamikazes as far from the carriers as possible. The system worked, but it consumed enormous resources. Maintaining constant fighter coverage at maximum strength required launching and recovering aircraft continuously. Flight deck crews worked until exhaustion became dangerous. By May 1945, the strain was visible. Essex had been in combat operations almost continuously for a year. The crew was exhausted. Aircraft were wearing out faster than maintenance could keep them operational. The ship needed another major maintenance period, but the invasion of Japan was scheduled for November. Every carrier was needed. Essex would continue operations through the end of the war, regardless of fatigue or mechanical issues. The end came suddenly. On August 6th, an atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. On August 9th, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15, Japan announced surrender. Essex was conducting operations off Japan when the announcement came. The crew received the news with cautious celebration. Many didn't believe it at first. Rumors of Japanese surrender had circulated before and proven false. But when official confirmation came from Admiral Halsey, the celebration became genuine. The war was over. They had survived. Essex remained off Japan through September, enforcing the surrender terms and providing air cover during the occupation. On September 2nd, representatives of the Japanese government signed surrender documents aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Essex aircraft flew overhead during the ceremony. The symbolism was deliberate. American carriers had destroyed Japanese naval power. American carriers would witness the final surrender. After the surrender, Essex participated in Operation Magic Carpet, transporting American soldiers and sailors from the Western Pacific back to the United States. The ship made 3 trips between October 1945 and January 1946, carrying over 10,000 men home. The mission was unglamorous but important. Getting American forces home quickly was a political priority. Essex was decommissioned on January 9, 1947, at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard and placed in reserve. The ship had served 3 years and 9 months in active commission. During that time, Essex had launched approximately 47,000 sorties, more than any other carrier in the Pacific Fleet. The ship's aircraft had destroyed over 1,000 Japanese aircraft. Essex had participated in every major Pacific campaign. From mid-1943 through the end of the war, the combat record was extraordinary. The ship remained in reserve for 4 years. In 1951, Essex was recommissioned for service in the Korean War. The ship was modernized with angled flight deck, steam catapults, and improved radar. Essex served through the Korean War and into the Vietnam War. The ship conducted combat operations off Vietnam from 1964 through 1966. Essex was finally decommissioned for the last time on June 30th, 1969, after 26 years of intermittent service. The ship was scrapped in 1975. Admiral Frederick Sherman continued commanding carriers through the end of the war. He was promoted to Vice Admiral in 1945 and took command of 1st Fast Carrier Task Force. After the war, Sherman served in various shore assignments and retired in 1947. He wrote a memoir, Combat Command, published in 1950, describing carrier operations in the Pacific. Sherman died in 1957 at age 72. His contributions to carrier aviation doctrine and tactics were recognized by naval historians as significant, though his name never achieved the public recognition of more flamboyant commanders like Halsey or Spruance. Lieutenant Commander John McCampbell, who led the fighter intercept on October the 25th, became the Navy's top ace of World War II with 34 confirmed kills. He received the Medal of Honor for actions on October the 24th, when he shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. After the war, McCampbell remained in the Navy and eventually reached the rank of captain. He retired in 1964 and died in 1996 at age 86. McCampbell rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. In occasional interviews, he credited his success to the Hellcat aircraft, good teammates, and excellent support from Essex's Combat Information Center. He emphasized that fighter pilots received recognition while the men who positioned them for success remained anonymous. The anonymous men were the flight deck crews, the radar operators, the fighter directors, the maintenance personnel, and the logistics specialists who made Essex function. Their names don't appear in histories. They received no individual medals. Most returned to civilian life after the war and never discussed their service, but their collective effort created the capability that destroyed Japanese naval aviation and enabled American victory in the Pacific. The technical systems they operated evolved into modern naval aviation. The Essex-class carrier design influenced every subsequent American carrier class. The Forrestal-class supercarriers of the 1950s incorporated Essex-class lessons about flight deck layout and hangar arrangements. The Nimitz-class nuclear carriers of the 1970s through today descended directly from Essex-class design principles. Modern carriers are larger, faster, and carry more sophisticated aircraft, but the fundamental operating concepts remain consistent with what Essex demonstrated in 1944. The Combat Information Center evolved into modern carrier combat direction centers with computer systems processing information from dozens of sensors simultaneously. The radar systems evolved from the SK-2 to modern phased array systems that can track hundreds of targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 300 miles. The fighter direction procedures evolved into automated systems that can coordinate defensive responses faster than human operators. But the underlying concept that Essex proved viable remains central to carrier operations. Detect threats early, coordinate defensive forces, position interceptors perfectly, destroy attacks before they threaten defended ships. The rapid launch capability that shocked Japanese commanders in 1944 became standard expectation for all carriers. Modern carriers launch and recover aircraft continuously during operations, maintaining constant air coverage. The procedures are more sophisticated now, with catapult launches replacing deck launches and with computer-controlled systems managing aircraft movements. But the goal remains identical: maximum aircraft in the air, minimum time on deck, continuous combat power. The logistical system supporting Essex expanded into the modern fleet train that enables American carrier battle groups to remain at sea for months without returning to port. Replenishment at sea became routine. Nuclear propulsion eliminated the need for carrier refueling, though embarked aircraft still require aviation fuel. The supply network supporting forward-deployed carriers moves millions of tons of supplies continuously. The scale dwarfs World War II logistics, but the principles remain the same. Sustained operations require sustained supply. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who witnessed the effectiveness of American carrier operations and authorized the first organized kamikaze attacks, survived the war. After Japan's surrender, Onishi committed ritual suicide on August 16, 1945. He left a written statement accepting responsibility for the kamikaze operations and apologizing to the families of the pilots who had died. The statement revealed that Onishi had understood the attacks were militarily futile, but felt compelled to demonstrate Japanese determination to fight regardless of cost. His suicide was his final demonstration of that same determination. The kamikaze pilots who flew missions against Essex and other American carriers were mostly young men in their late teens and early 20s. Many had minimal flight training. Some had less than 50 hours total flight time. They volunteered for suicide missions, believing they were serving their country honorably. Some letters and diaries that survived reveal that many were terrified, but felt they couldn't refuse without bringing shame to themselves and their families. The cultural pressure to volunteer was enormous. The waste of those young lives represents one of the tragedies of the Pacific War. The broader tragedy was that Japan's strategic position was hopeless by October 1944. American industrial superiority was overwhelming. American technological advantages in radar, communications, and logistics were decisive. American training systems produced pilots and specialists faster than Japan could replace losses. Continuing the war accomplished nothing except prolonging destruction. But institutional momentum and cultural factors prevented rational strategic assessment. The war continued for another 10 months, resulting in hundreds of thousands of additional deaths, including the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, of which the October 25th air engagements were part, became the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 sailors participated in actions spread across hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean. American forces sank 4 Japanese carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Japanese naval power was effectively destroyed. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force. Individual ships survived and conducted occasional operations, but coordinated fleet actions were no longer possible. Essex's contribution to that victory was representative of American carrier effectiveness generally. The ship didn't achieve unique individual accomplishments. Essex was one of many carriers operating with similar capability. That was exactly the point. American success came from building multiple capable platforms and operating them systematically, not through individual heroics or brilliant commanders, though both existed, but through engineering, training, logistics, and procedure that created reliable superiority across all dimensions of carrier operations. The lessons from Essex's service and from American carrier operations generally influenced post-war naval development worldwide. The Soviet Union studied American carrier techniques and attempted to develop similar capabilities. Soviet carriers never achieved American levels of effectiveness, partly because the Soviet Union lacked comparable industrial base, and partly because Soviet naval doctrine emphasized submarine warfare over carrier aviation. The British Royal Navy maintained carrier forces through the Cold War, using principles learned from cooperation with American carriers during World War II. Modern British carriers reflect American design influences. The technological trajectory from 1944 to present day is remarkable. Essex launched 72 propeller-driven Hellcats in 9 minutes, using procedures coordinated by human operators with grease pencils and voice radio. Modern carriers launch jet aircraft at supersonic speeds using steam catapults or electromagnetic launch systems. The launches are coordinated by computer systems processing data from satellites and distributed sensor networks. The scale and sophistication are vastly greater, but the underlying purpose remains identical. Generate combat power quickly, sustain it continuously, defeat enemy forces before they threaten friendly forces. The human element remains constant across 80 years of carrier evolution. Flight deck operations are still dangerous. Maintenance still requires skilled technicians working long hours. Pilots still face combat stress. Commanders still make tactical decisions under uncertainty. The technology assists human capability, but doesn't replace human judgment, skill, or courage. The crew of Essex in 1944 faced challenges similar to crews of modern carriers. The equipment has changed, but the essential nature of carrier operations remains recognizable. The rapid launch capability that Essex demonstrated on October 25, 1944, resulted from systematic engineering and procedural optimization. The ship's designers had analyzed carrier operations, identified bottlenecks, and engineered solutions. The crew had trained to execute procedures precisely under stress. The logistics system provided everything needed to sustain operations. No single factor was decisive. The integration of engineering, training, logistics, and procedure created capability that exceeded the sum of components. Japanese commanders who witnessed American carrier effectiveness but couldn't match it faced the fundamental problem of competing against systematic institutional capability. Individual Japanese pilots were skilled and brave. Individual Japanese ships were well designed. But the Japanese Navy lacked the systematic integration that characterized American operations. The institutional culture emphasized individual initiative over standardized procedure. The industrial base couldn't produce equipment at American rates. The training pipeline couldn't replace losses. These structural disadvantages became insurmountable once American forces reached full operational capability in mid-1944. The war in the Pacific demonstrated that modern warfare requires more than weapons and warriors. It requires industrial capacity, technological innovation, systematic training, effective logistics, and institutional adaptability. The side that integrates these elements successfully gains decisive advantages. Japan had warriors and weapons, but lacked the industrial and institutional capacity to compete with American systematic warfare. The outcome became inevitable once American forces demonstrated their full capability. Essex symbolized that capability. The ship was one of 24 Essex-class carriers, not unique, but representative. The fact that 24 carriers of similar capability could be built, manned, supplied, and operated simultaneously demonstrated American industrial and organizational capacity that Japan couldn't match. Each individual carrier contributed to overwhelming collective superiority. Essex's 72 fighters, launched in 9 minutes, were multiplied across multiple carriers to produce defensive fighter coverage the Japanese strikes couldn't penetrate. The photograph exists in the National Archives. Taken on the flight deck of Essex during October 1944, it shows dozens of Hellcats spotted for launch, plane handlers in colored jerseys moving between aircraft. The composition captures the organized complexity of carrier operations. Every person visible has a specific role. Every aircraft is positioned precisely. The image represents systematic capability, translated into tactical power. The men in that photograph are anonymous. Most are visible only as distant figures. Their faces aren't clear enough to identify. They were young, probably 18 to 25 years old. Most would survive the war and return to civilian life. A few would be killed in accidents or combat. All of them contributed to capability that helped win the Pacific War. Their individual stories are mostly lost. They became statistics, crew numbers, replacement personnel. But collectively, they operated the most effective naval weapons system developed during World War II. The carriers they served on, Essex and her sisters, represented American industrial democracy's response to military aggression. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States possessed 7 carriers total. 4 years later, the United States operated over 100 carriers of all types. The industrial expansion was unprecedented. Shipyards that had built merchant vessels converted to warship construction. Workers who had never seen a ship learned to weld, rivet, and assemble complex vessels. The production rate accelerated throughout the war. By 1944, new Essex-class carriers were being completed every 6 to 8 weeks. Japan couldn't compete with that production rate. Japanese industry produced excellent individual ships, but couldn't produce them in sufficient quantities. The disparity became fatal. Every Japanese carrier sunk was irreplaceable. Every American carrier sunk was replaced by multiple new construction. The mathematics of attrition favored America completely. Japanese commanders recognized this by 1944, but had no solution. Kamikaze attacks attempted to change the mathematics by achieving higher hit rates per sortie, but even improved hit rates couldn't overcome the production disparity. The final assessment of Essex's service must acknowledge both the ship's technical capability and the broader context that made that capability decisive. Essex was an outstanding warship, well-designed and superbly operated. But Essex succeeded because the ship was supported by overwhelming industrial production, comprehensive logistics, systematic training, and technological innovation that Japan couldn't match. Individual weapons or platforms rarely determine war outcomes. Integrated systems, supported by robust industrial bases, determine outcomes. Essex proved this principle through 3 years of Pacific combat operations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.